Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming to this session about terrorism, which I think we'd all agree is fairly central to the overall question of this conference, whether the U.S. is back or not, whether we like it or not. Since 9/11, the problem of global terrorism has been central. It's played a central role in the U.S. approach to the world. And probably even more importantly, it's played a very central role in the way the rest of the world perceives the U.S. And its actions and its relative strength. There was a period in the 2000s when there was a sense, I think, around the world that the U.S. was bogged down in the Middle East, that its relative power globally was declining because of that. That impression has changed, but even as it's changing, there are now new calls for the U.S. to get more involved in the Middle East, to put boots on the ground to fight groups like Islamic State. And I think there are real questions about what that means for U.S. power and also for regions like Asia. Very happy to introduce this distinguished panel who's going to talk about this. To my immediate left here is Dr. Ephraim Inbar, who's a professor of political studies at Bar Ilan University near Tel Aviv. He's the director of its Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. He was a visiting professor at Johns Hopkins before that and Georgetown, as well as at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And he's published several books, including The Israeli-Turkish Entente and Israel's National Security. To his left, Dr. Ellen Leipson is the president and CEO of the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and she also directs its Middle East and Southwest Asia program. Before the Stimson Center, she spent many years in government. She served on the Secretary of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board since 2011. Before that, she was vice chair of the National Intelligence Council from 1997 to 2002, and she has served on the State Department's policy planning staff and was a specialist in Middle East affairs for the Congressional Research Service. To her left, Dr. Park Hyun-do is a Humanities Korea research professor in the Institute of Middle Eastern Affairs at Myongji University here in Korea. He serves as a policy advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as a lecturer at the Ministry of Culture, Sports, and Tourism. And he is editor-in-chief of Religion and Peace, an English-language journal published by the International Peace Corps of Religions. He's written extensively on Islam in the Middle East and has done Korean translations of several constitutions of countries in the Middle East. And last but not least, Dr. Joseph Kachishian, a senior fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and the CEO of Kachishian Associates, a consulting partnership that provides analysis on the Arabian and Persian Gulf region. He is also a fellow journalist, a senior writer with Dubai-based Gulf News, and previously served as the honorary consul of the Sultanate of Oman in Los Angeles, California. So thank you all for being here. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Nisrat Ajari. I'm an editor with Bloomberg View covering Asia for Bloomberg's opinion section. So as per the other panels, what we're going to do is just go down the line, and each panelist will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. And then we'll have a discussion among us, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. So, Dr. Inbar.
Okay, thank you. Some people call me a terrorist because I'm a tough editor, and I also can use weapons, but that's almost every Israeli. I would like just to make a remark about the tone of the discussion. Until now, there is some search for world order, which I feel uncomfortable with, because there will always be world disorder. There will always be people dissatisfied and desperate enough to endanger their lives and to be terrorists. The phenomenon we are discussing here, and I relate to a pre-panel exchange, Ellen made a good point that the analytical framework for discussing what it's happening now in the Middle East is not necessarily terrorism. It's a different analytical framework, tool. And we are basically dealing with sub-state groups that operate in ungoverned areas. And what has been happening in the Middle East is basically that we see the emergence of failed states. This is not something new, by the way. It's not a result of the Arab Spring. It preceded the Arab Spring. A failed state is basically a state which lost monopoly over use of force. This is a Weberian definition of a modern political entity, and we've seen it already in Lebanon before the Arab Spring. We've seen it in Somalia. We've seen it with the Palestinian Authority, which lost control over part of its territory to Hamas. And of course, what we see now, it's the same phenomenon, failed states in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, and part of the population has been radicalized due to its identity. We see a clear identity, which is an inherent part of the region, and some of the Muslims are attracted to very radical versions of Islam. And this is what we see basically in our region, and it is attracting also Muslims elsewhere. The volunteers we are seeing coming to help the IS are part of disgruntled Muslim population that is not able to face modernity. IS, in particular, is more effective because it is helped by a state. Turkey, there is growing evidence that Turkey is helping this organization for its own reasons. And of course, this type of state support enhances the capabilities of every sub-state group. This is true, of course, of Hamas, that has been helped by Iran. Iran also helped another terrorist group, such as Hezbollah. And with this type of state support, they become more dangerous. In my view, this type of organization will spread in the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa region, because of the type of states we have. And we may see them, we already see them in other parts of the world, Boko Haram in Nigeria. We may see it in Chad or in other places where we have Muslim population. Even in Europe, we see the beginnings of this type of organizations in France, in the UK, in Belgium, in Germany. And of course, the Iranian presence that helps this type of organization, and they are able to be in the Balkans. We may see them in Mexico. I wouldn't be surprised to see Qassams on the southern border of the United States, because Hezbollah has a ring of drugs supplying to the Mexican barons. And my friend Americans, be prepared. The same is true of Argentina, of course Venezuela, which is part of this alliance. This type of organization will spread also because we'll see more ungoverned areas. And when we have ungoverned areas, the state has less ability to control its territory, and as a result of that, the bad guys have more freedom of action. It's simple. Where you have a strong police, you have less crime. When you have a weak police, you have more crime. Apart from that, we'll see this phenomenon growing also because as a state loses control over its territory, its national arsenals become more accessible to the bad guys. And we've seen already sensitive equipment, missiles coming from Libya to Hamas. We've seen, and we try to fight it, sensitive equipment coming from Syria, where this country is disintegrating, into the hands of the Hezbollah, and we may see it in other countries as well. What is the appropriate strategy? This we were asked beforehand. What is the appropriate strategy for dealing with this type of phenomenon? And I must say that I felt uncomfortable with the American war on terror. Because the basic idea behind the war on terror was to create new societies in the American image. And state building, winning hearts and minds. Living in my region, I know that it's not easy to win the hearts of minds of my neighbors. Some people don't like America, let's face it. Americans, in my view, are great. I would live in America if I wouldn't be a Zionist. But not everybody likes America. And not everybody wants to be democratic. Therefore, the appropriate strategy is not nation building, is not regime change, which is conducted with the best intentions. But we know that sometimes the best intentions lead us to unwanted places. What I suggest is a much more modest strategy. Basically, military attrition of the terrorists, of the sub-state groups. You're not going to change them. We cannot change Hamas. We cannot change Hezbollah. The Americans are not going to change IS. But they can kill them little by little, to contain them, to limit their damage. In Israeli strategic parlance, we call it mowing the grass. We don't want a political victory. What America has done at the end of the World War II, creating a Germany in its image, creating a Japan in its image, is not feasible today in these places for a variety of reasons. Therefore, attrition with a small footprint of boots on the ground, this is what is needed. This is what the American system or the Israeli system will digest. Occupation is a bad word, as we all know. And this is cost-effective over the long time. Yeah, it's true. We want victories. We want quick victories. Americans in particular, they want fast food, everything is quick. But you have to be patient in order to deal with this type of phenomena. And we shouldn't forget that terror is, after all, the weapon of the weak. The strong guys don't use terror. They use tanks, airplanes. So in many ways, terror is a problem of secondary order. It's not the main issue facing America or the West. Terror is some kind of nuisance that the West should learn to live with. It's not pleasant. We wish it will go away. But just as crime, it will not go away. We have to minimize its consequences. That's all. There is only one danger, real danger, that those bad guys will get nuclear weapons. And I can see that Iran or North Korea will transfer this type of weapons to their proxies, and then we are going to have bad news. But then we have to deal with the nuclear powers. And I just heard, what are you going to do in North Korea? Instead of admitting that it was a mistake not to hit North Korean nuclear installation when they are being built, now you just adjust to an impossible situation. This is true of Iran as well. If Iran is allowed to get a nuclear bomb within this framework agreement, which is a joke, we may see not only terrorist groups, but of course, other countries getting nuclear weapons. We'll see Actually, I would prefer to participate in the panel parallel to us, which is about non-proliferation. That's Orwellian language for proliferation, of course. And I will end with that.
Okay. Thank you. Ellen?
Thanks. So let's agree that terrorism is an ancient topic. It's a political tool that has been used over the centuries by disaffected groups or individuals trying to change the dynamics of a political environment that they're in. And let's accept that it is, to some respects, global. It can pop up in any region where there's contested politics, where there's alienation, etc. Let's also agree that terrorism, it's hard to look at terrorism in a vacuum these days because terrorism has also changed and mutated in the age of globalization. So we sometimes don't know whether we're looking at a problem that is principally terrorism or is it illicit trade and trafficking that is both at the front end and the back end of enhancing and enabling terrorists to do their work. We are seeing that terrorists are embedded in other illicit activities, and so there's a chicken and egg problem of where do you begin to think about terrorism. I think if we had had a panel on terrorism 5 years ago or 3 years ago, we would be telling perhaps a largely positive story about the capacity of the international community to address a thorny problem. That after 9/11, the United States, if we want to refer quite early on in the discussion to American leadership and America's role here, that the United States did successfully create new global mechanisms to respond to terrorism, in part because of the great solidarity that I think was felt after 9/11 among many, many countries. And so we began a period of rather remarkable cooperation at the international level. Things that happened in the Bush administration were the creation of terrorist financing cooperation that included banks, including in parts of the world that may not have wanted to be associated with an American policy. We created a legal and diplomatic framework for engaging on terrorism. And so if we had met a few years ago, we might be saying we have reduced the threat that we're feeling from al-Qaeda. Yes, it is true that al-Qaeda has its affiliates and is popping up in different places. It's no longer as centrally controlled or as geographically confined an organization, but it now has these smaller satellite offshoots in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Maghreb, in West Africa, etc. But I think meeting this year, it's important that we question our confidence about terrorism and the tools to confront terrorism. I do consider ISIS, which uses terrorism as one of its tools, to be a deeper and more difficult challenge. And I do think the concentration of terrorist organizations in the Muslim world is something we just have to recognize. We're not talking as much about terrorism in the Colombian civil insurgency or the use of terrorism in other parts of the world. Maybe others on the panel will want to do so, but I think we are seeing a concentration, a mimicking, a copycat phenomenon of terrorist behavior and activities, particularly in the Muslim world, but the very wide Muslim world, from Africa to Southeast Asia, not just concentrated in the Middle East. So I guess I'm questioning whether some of these patterns of global cooperation that have been established will be sufficient. You know, again, after 9/11, some of the responses were paramilitary responses. Many of them are law enforcement. Lots of cooperation among police and border security forces in various countries, enormous amount of negotiating and cooperation over sharing airline passenger lists, and really the international community has worked very hard on this problem. And occasionally you see an effort that is addressing the underlying causes. What is the source of alienation? Is it lack of jobs? Is it poor quality education? Is it weak governance in countries that simply are no longer delivering services to their citizens? So there was this, you know, attempt to be comprehensive. I am struck with how inadequate those responses seem in the face of the challenge of ISIS, because ISIS to me is only partly a terrorist phenomenon and really something even harder, a harder problem set. It is, it really has larger and more ambitious goals than most terrorist organizations as we have thought of them traditionally. They have territorial ambition, they do believe they are worthy of replacing incumbent power, and they are demonstrating in their success in controlling some population centers in both Syria and Iraq, if not Yemen, Libya, and beyond, that they are really undermining whatever remaining legitimacy exists in the state structure in this part of the world. So I think that we have to now be humble and self-critical in whether the instruments that have been developed in the age of counterterrorism, these robust mechanisms that we've created, this whole big part of the American bureaucracy that works on counterterrorism, whether those approaches and those tools will be sufficient to diminish the threat that ISIS represents. Because ISIS really is a manifestation of a much greater failure of governance in at least parts of the Middle East. There are many countries in the Middle East that are functioning sufficiently well. Many of the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, certainly Morocco, we hope for Tunisia, Algeria. We are not suggesting that this has affected every state in the region. But the states that it has affected, in some cases, are strategically important states, either by their population, by their location, or by their strategic resources. So I am trying to just raise the conundrum that the tools that we developed when terrorism was the Al-Qaeda threat are proving to be counterproductive in many cases. And I do think we have to raise the question, and it's being raised in policy circles in the United States and presumably elsewhere, of whether this kinetic approach, the tactical approach to trying to physically degrade ISIS's ability to control territory in Syria and Iraq, is in fact feeding ISIS's recruitment strategy. So we are in an unhealthy cycle of action and reaction that I think raises some, it's genuinely a conundrum. I think it's a true dilemma for us. We want very much to help the Iraqi government remain in control of its territory. In the case of Syria, of course, it becomes a much more complicated calculation, but there is certainly a strong argument in favor of doing something and of using military cooperation as a very important instrument of American power. But we have to question whether that role of the United States in those circumstances has, in fact, proven to have limited effect or even been counterproductive. There is a danger, I think, that ISIS, which is very modern in its use of social media, in its communications capacities, etc., is able to very quickly turn around interventions by the outside world to its favor and make an argument in favor of its continued rise. And I think that we also have to shade our understanding a bit of what's the motivation of a young person from a country like, whether it's Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, who joins ISIS. These are not always individuals that are despairing, but they are excited and exhilarated by the opportunity to be on what they see as a winning team. That ISIS does have a positive appeal, not just a negative appeal. That's what we are coming to understand from some of the young people that have been recruited by ISIS and then trying to leave. So I think we are left with one of those problems that we know a lot. It echoes something that was said this morning, that just because the world is more transparent, that there's much more information available to us, we can monitor crises in different parts of the world with much greater detail, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the action responses are any easier. So in the end, some of the predicaments that have led to the rise of ISIS have to be resolved within these societies. In some cases, this is a debate within Sunni Islam. In other cases, it's a question of very weak and inadequate governance structures, a need to rebuild a pact between citizens and their government in these critical countries of the Muslim world. And these outside interventions and our belief that we can somehow manage or diminish the problem may have very limited short-term impact, but could be very costly and even counterproductive in the long run. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Whenever I hear about the terrorism itself, actually, the definition always bothers my mind, actually. And whether terrorism is such an act of violence only by brutal forces or a simple way of terrorizing, well, casting terror into the minds and hearts of people. Living in a country where the government has been grappling with the terrorist and failed state in the north for the last 70 years. Koreans are very sensitive to the issue of terrorism itself because it is not a matter of others, it is our own matter. But problem in our country is that Koreans have been domiciled, in a sense, with a quite relaxed idea about the terrorism, because for the last 70 years, even though we have been threatened by North Korea, well, very harshly, nevertheless, people think very easily, take it very easily that, well, we will not be offended by certain forces. Only in 2001, 9/11 incident, actually, the Koreans get a wake-up call. And recently, a young teenager called Mr. Kim joined ISIL after crossing the Turkish border into Syria. And Koreans now came to once again understand the terror or ISIL is not very far from Korea. So we have actually two fronts for Koreans, actually, the failed and terrorist regime in Middle East and also the ISIL. And also our failed brother in the north. So, and also Korea is a very important place in a sense, and very dangerous and risky place because we have about more than 20,000 American military personnel stationed in this country. So terrorism is a very important issue. Nevertheless, I don't know how I can possibly address this issue to my colleagues and my Korean and to brothers and sisters. But whenever I think about the terrorism itself as we mentioned, that it is the weapon of the weak. Yeah, definitely one of the main reasons why terrorism is on the rise is probably it has been linked with the poverty level, and those people who have nothing. And those people who have nothing to lose, they can easily resort to that kind of brutal forces in order to realize their own political or religious the ideology. And sometimes I thought to myself, actually, what if the ISIL did not use such cruel forces to terrorize people? Then probably they could be very successful in expanding their spheres of influences in every corner of the Middle East. And then we would have actually the very dangerous, another, well, draconian terrorist country in the Middle East. It's very difficult. I don't know how I can possibly think about and get away from this kind of act. And often sometimes I ask myself too, what if we just leave those people in the Middle East alone without caring or without considering at all? But certainly we cannot do because of the oil. Well, it is quite irony that the West and Korea and all the countries deserted Africa for a long time, never taking into consideration their poverty levels, all the agonies. And Africa is suffering, but we are always concentrating on the Middle East, and because of the oil. So we need to find some way to enlighten not only the people in the Middle East, but also the people in the so-called developed countries in order to precisely define the terrorism. Well, I have a lot of mixed and complicated ideas about the terrorism, but anyway, definitely we need to address the issue, but more than anything else, we need to think about it a little bit more, because not only the people who can use brutal forces, but also the country itself can be very, very terrorist, because sometimes the so-called developed countries can use their military forces with thinking that they are using very justified means of violence. Well, this is okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the Asan Institute for the invitation to be here, and I'm always glad to be back in Korea. I have 5 minutes really to discuss a very complex issue. What I'm going to do is focus on other questions than the ones that we've heard, most of which I accept. And perhaps the best way to do it is to say I have some good news and I have bad news. The good news is that this is a very small gathering, which means that the cyber war and non-proliferation fellows are probably busier than we are, which is a good sign, which means terrorism has taken on a backseat now because their people are there, not here. Now, let me start by recalling something. According to Muhammad Haykal, I'm going to read you a quote from one of his books, which he published in 1975, called The Road to Ramadan. According to Muhammad Haykal, who used to be Nasser's best friend, the Libyan strongman Muammar Gaddafi held the following exchange at a September 1970 League of Arab States summit in Cairo. The exchange is between Gaddafi and King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, and of course, Nasser adds his 2 cents. Quote, this is Gaddafi first. If we are faced with a madman like the Jordanian King Hussein, who wants to kill his people, we must send someone to seize him, handcuff him, stop him from doing what he's doing, and take him off to an asylum. Faisal interjects. He says, I don't think you should call an Arab king a madman who should be taken to an asylum. Gaddafi replies, but all his family are mad. It's a matter of record. Faisal, well, perhaps all of us are mad. At which point Nasser interferes, and he says, sometimes when you see what is going on in the Arab world, Your Majesty, I think this may be so. I suggest we appoint a doctor to examine us regularly and find out which ones are crazy. Faisal concludes this conversation by the following statement. I would like your doctor to start with me, because in view of what I see, I doubt I shall be able to preserve my reason. Now, to talk about terrorism in the age of ISIS is, of course, enough to test one's sanity, though I suspect that Ibrahim al-Baghdadi, the self-appointed caliph of the Islamic State, probably qualifies for an appointment with Nasser's physician. In the past, we talked about Al-Qaeda era. We have a tendency nowadays to speak of the latest terrorist groupings, although we are very selective. Somehow we ignore the terrorist groups that we don't like and focus on the ones that are in the public eye and catch a lot of attention. A few years ago, you remember we were talking about the Khorasan group. Nobody talks about the Khorasan group anymore. For some reason, I don't know what happened to them. We talk about the Iraqi militias. We don't talk about the Iranian-sponsored terrorist groups, whether this or that, Hezbollah being the most prominent, which Ephraim mentioned a few moments ago. Of course, now we're focusing on the Houthis, and nobody knows who we're going to focus on next. I suspect there will be another group that will emerge very soon. Terrorism has its conveniences, except for the victims. I'm not talking about them, since it is easy to lump a lot under the rubric of terrorism. I think it might be better to stop using the term altogether. I suggest that we stop talking about terrorism. This is no longer a worthy subject of intellectual debate. I'll come back to what the governments will do in a second. But intellectually speaking, I think terrorism has really outlived its value. And instead, we should focus on the violence that are being committed by certain groups against other groups. Pure violence, killings, assassinations, murders, whatever terms we want to use. Terrorism is a legal term, as I'm sure most of you know. And under that legal term, it is possible to lump a great deal of nonsense, which is what we have done for the past several decades. And of course, terrorism is used by groups and certain countries, save, of course, when the countries that use violence are not called terrorists. They are called legitimate self-defense. Governments have a monopoly, as Ephraim said. Governments have a monopoly on the use of force. They use tanks, and they use airplanes, and they use submarines, and ballistic missiles, and all the beautiful things that we like to play around with. Everybody likes to play a Monday morning general. But obviously, the terrorist doesn't have access to all of these weapons. Therefore, the terrorist is using propaganda and violence in order to get the message across. So, where do we go for all this? How do we deal with acts of violence as we see it? I'm going to make 3 suggestions. Now, the first suggestion, of course, is not mine. It's been going on for a few years, and UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy that has been proposed by several countries, of course, led by Saudi Arabia. The late King Abdullah financed the creation of this UN group, in which, obviously, he recommended, and United Nations groups have accepted the terms, that in fact governments have to have common strategies, at the regional level and at the global level. Presumably they will do the defense business that they're involved in. They will secure borders as need be, whether it is fingerprinting everybody at the airport or listening to all of our email conversations to find out who is doing what. Obviously, they have to support the victims of terrorist organizations, of terrorist groups. The victims have rights as well, and presumably under this global strategy, the victims will be provided some help. There should be some control over the finances that terrorist organizations might be involved to control the transfer of large sums of money from one group to the other. As I said a few moments ago, people are now focusing on cyber warfare and so on and so forth. So therefore, the first recommendation is that we should continue at this global strategy initiative to make sure that there is full cooperation among nation states. But that's not enough. The second suggestion I have is to really focus on the creation of wealth in the countries where these violent phenomena arise. It seems to me, and I accept what Ellen said a few moments ago, that in fact we have a failure of government responsibility. Better self-governance is obviously something which is not frequently available in places like Syria, Iraq, Libya, and so on. But I think that it is important for the rest of the international community, if we want to take the long-term perspective about curtailing violence, which will never be eliminated fully, but if we want to curtail the use of violence, then the creation of wealth has to be a priority in those countries where these young men and women are in fact ready to sacrifice everything. A few years ago, in 2010, Muhammad Bouazizi set himself in fire in Tunis because a policewoman slapped him because he didn't have a license to essentially sell vegetables to provide for his family. That, to me, is a greater indictment of the Tunisian government at the time than anything else. That the fact that this guy was trying to earn a living, he was trying to create wealth, And the government decided that, in fact, or the government institutions, through that policewoman's actions, decided that this was a secondary issue, that somehow law and order, obeying the law, having a license to sell was far more important than the creation of wealth. Unless governments pay attention to the creation of wealth, we will not make a dent in this area. And I think that Western countries have a role to play in this area as well. The third and final point, and I will add to what Ellen said before, I think that it's very important to really promote liberty in many of the countries where these acts of violence occur. I have not done any kind of studies on this, but I suspect common sense and logic indicates to me that where there is violence, there is little liberty. Where there is a lot of liberty, there is less violence. Of course, this is not a zero-sum game, and it's not equal. Of course, there is violence in industrialized countries. You know, as we speak, there are problems in Baltimore, and we've seen a lot of problems in Europe, in the United States, throughout the world. But I think that, generally speaking, in the Middle Eastern countries, where you have more liberty, you have less violence. And if we promote more and more policies that lead to further proper governance, more liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of association, all the wonderful freedoms that we take for granted, I think we are likely to see less violence, which is probably something good for the rest of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it was fascinating. We have about a half an hour left, so I'm just going to ask a couple questions myself, and then we can throw it open to the floor for further questions. Ephraim, I wanted to follow up on what you were saying about making military attrition be the primary strategy for combating these groups, and pick up on something Ellen said, which is that it's arguable that, you know, in the last 14 years since 9/11, it's precisely been the U.S. and global, but particularly the U.S. Response, military response to these issues that has spurred the greatest recruitment to groups like ISIS. I mean, you have a generation of people who have grown up knowing a world in which the U.S. has, in their view, been attacking Muslims, you know, for the last 15 years. How would you respond to that? I mean, is this enough, or is this just going to create more?
Yeah, I would like to, first of all, I'll come back to that, to respond to Joe's. I was surprised you made those comments from what I don't know of you. Facts. There is no correlation whatsoever shown by studies between poverty, education, and terrorism. There are poor guys and rich guys that are engaged in terrorism. So solving the poverty problems of a certain area, be it Arab world or whatever, will not solve the problem of terrorism. Apart from that, your liberty. Totalitarian regimes where there is no liberty usually have no problems of terrorism. So again, the facts go against this, liberal myth that, we have to fix the societies. It's not working like that. There will always probably be people that, because of their personal temperament, whatever, take arms to fight against the convention in society. That's, take a look at history. Now back to military attrition. First of all, the strategy of the United States in the war against terror was nation building. Was not, it was, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, American soldiers in Iraq, tens of thousands in Afghanistan. They were trying to fix those problems, to fix Afghanistan of all places. It's very ambitious, very noble, but it's not going to work. Anybody that knows a little bit of the history of Afghanistan, the Brits were there, the Russians were there, and now the Americans achieved the same results. There are certain places which cannot be fixed because of the people that live there. That's it. Mafia is in Sicilia. I don't know much about Sicilia, but I know that many mafia people come from Sicilia. Why? Needs anthropological, I don't know what kind of study. But bringing wealth to Sicilia will not make them good citizens. That's a fact of life. Now about, so the strategy of the Americans was to win the war, destroy as much as possible the bad guys, implant enlightened government, Maliki in Iran today, which is a lackey of Iran. In Iraq, yeah, he's a lackey of Iran. So this was the idea. And of course, it doesn't work. So what I'm saying, what is the alternative? Those guys try to damage. They try to get to it. What can you do about it? You conquering them means a lot of blood and treasure. What I'm suggesting is a more modest approach. Actually, the only good thing I have to say about Obama, believe me, it makes an effort on my part, is that he got it right I'm not sure for the right reasons, but he got it right vis-a-vis ISIS. They fly. The American intensive effort is 10 sorties, 15 sorties, maybe more with the allies, and to try to contain ISIS. After all, ISIS has been more or less contained. For the people that live under ISIS, it's not a great pleasure, I assume. But I don't think that it's my responsibility, or the American responsibility to take care of the people of the whole world. I have to take care first of myself. And I want to, this is a problem for me, I want to spend as little as possible to try to live with this problem, which is not going to disappear. Therefore, we should concentrate on debilitating their capabilities, hunting them, making their lives difficult in order to divert some of their energies to self-defense rather than to cause trouble to us. And hopefully one day, the population there will come to their senses, will kick them out. It may take a long time. But it's not the responsibility of the West to provide order to areas which are inherently without order. I cannot be that altruistic. I'm sorry. I live in an egoistic system, self-help system. I must help myself first. Therefore, this is a very modest strategy, a long-term strategy, low cost. And this is the only way to limit the damage they are doing. We cannot eradicate this phenomenon.
Let me follow up on this. I mean, to what extent do you think this problem is a central problem for the U.S. specifically anymore? As we were saying, cyber war, the rise of China, nuclear non-proliferation, there are huge issues to deal with. Terrorism, because of the spectacle of it, because of their use of social media, can feel very immediate in the U.S. media. But is it a problem?
So I think it's a good it's a good analytic problem to try to figure out how different is this world we live in now from the Al-Qaeda period, where I agree with Ephraim, we did come to the conclusion that it's not an existential threat to life as we know it, that it's a problem, it's a nuisance, it has to be managed, and we can sort of beat it back in various tactical ways. But I think ISIS really is scarier than that, and I think that the question of the defiance against boundaries, the erosion of the capacity of the state to manage its territory, etc. And I don't think that the U.S. solution is that we be the ones to constantly be sort of trying to contain ISIS or make ISIS have to retreat from the area. And maybe we've had, that the Iraqis and the various forces in the region have had partial successes so that ISIL is not just constantly gaining territory. It loses, it moves on to another town, it consolidates or has to pull back a little bit within the larger towns of Iraq. So it's a back and forth situation. But I think what we are trying to do is strengthen local capacity to manage ISIS. So, but I think there was a genuine nervousness at the beginning that ISIS could be a direct threat to the United States or to the interests of our friends and our presence in the region, et cetera. Maybe we've calmed down a little bit and are not putting it at the highest rung of our priorities. I think also the connection to WMD is a very important one. And really in the post 9/11 period, one of the most important things that the UN did was, call on all member states to demonstrate that they are taking measures to make sure that WMD materials cannot get into the hands of terrorism. And there's been a whole suite of activities to try to help countries of the global south comply with these WMD requirements. So while Joe is saying that maybe the WMD session is more popular, there is an important way in which they're linked, that the WMD issue is also linked to the terrorism issue. So I guess, I would say that you've asked an important question. I personally am less worried that ISIL is a direct threat to the United States than maybe we were 6 months ago. But I don't think anybody feels much satisfaction that we know that this problem will go away. And this idea of the caliphate, I think that we do have to sort of open our minds to trying to understand what this means in some places. We've been very interested in my organization to look at whether the idea of the caliphate is starting to appeal to Asian Muslims, beyond the Arab world. What's the Pakistani discourse on the caliphate? And are ISIL's ideas starting to spread in their appeal? Because that doesn't lend itself to military interventions, but it certainly can change the politics of countries in which we do have a direct interest.
Right. So before I continue, we've got about 20 minutes left. I want to make sure there's enough time for people to ask questions. So if anybody in the audience has a question, do you want to raise your hand?
Are you giving me a chance to answer Ephraim's question or not? I can wait.
No, please go ahead. If you want to.
I think that Ephraim raised very important points, and I appreciate that. Of course, I have been called far worse than being liberal. And as a graduate of Thomas Jefferson's University, I take liberalism rather seriously. But I think you're right that in dictatorships where there is no liberty, there is very little terrorism. But Ephraim, you agree, you and I are on the same page. Dictatorships are not what we want as a model for human life. That's not for us. That's for another species. I think that's the ideal. Now, the one thing that I would like to add to this conversation is that if you look at the post-2011, some of the books that are being published in this period by exiled Syrians, exiled Iraqis, and you read some of their discourses, the experiences that they've had under these dictatorships, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Iraq and elsewhere, you will see that there is this hunger for liberty. And I've recently read two books that still give me shivers even when I think about this. One particular man who served for 13 years in Bashar al-Assad's prison, and before him, Hafiz al-Assad's prison. He was tortured for 13 years, essentially. And he survived long enough to be freed a couple of years ago, moved to Sweden, wrote this book in Arabic, which unfortunately is not available in English yet. I wish somebody would translate it, in which he talked about his quest for liberty. And the reason why he endured for 13 years in that jail is because he knew that he would eventually be free. And he would either die or be free. And he never lost hope. And I think lots of people in the Arab world really are looking forward to this. The model for them is not dictatorship. And the United States, as a major power, cannot kill every terrorist around the world. We just can't do that. We just can't kill everybody. At the end of the day, we have to think how, with all due respect, Israel has not been able to kill every terrorist around the world, and it still is at war, and it still has enemies. So therefore, with all due respect to you, and I think that it is important to broaden this conversation to see what else we can do to really meet the demands that young people have, young and old, have in the Muslim world.
Thank you. Karen, do you have I don't know if we have microphones. Yes, we do.
Yeah, I'd like, is this on?
Yeah.
To follow on that, because it does seem another of the conundrums, to use Ellen's word, that she raised. Is it counterproductive to be killing so many people? And from my own time in the Middle East, I hear a lot of what you're saying, that liberty is a word we're embarrassed to use, but it really is a desire people have. So, but I'm curious why you all think that this violence, terrorism, violence against fellows in the Islamic world has grown so big. Why now? Because as all of you pointed out, it's not a completely new phenomenon, but it is certainly a growing one. So what causes it now? And is if you increase liberty, do you increase the risk of terrorism, which is the point you're making? But I think there is a hunger for less about money, but more about dignity, justice, that's part of what people find appealing about Islam and about conservative Islam, is this sense that we're going to have real justice, not this kind of man-made puppet government, Western, back to strongman stuff, that they believe Islam offers that to them. So why is it growing now is my real question.
Do you want to take that? Start with that, Joseph?
Well, I mean, on top of my head, the rise of inequality certainly is one of the reasons why now I think people are realizing the creation of wealth that has started in the post-boom, oil boom era has created pockets of wealth throughout the Arab world, throughout the Muslim world. There are success stories in the Muslim world. You or someone mentioned, I think it was Ellen who mentioned, and you may have mentioned it this morning as well, in the Gulf Cooperation Council states, there is a great deal of attention that is being paid to this question of creation of wealth and eradication of poverty and so on. Dubai is a success model by anybody's measure, and there are others, of course. So the fact that you have, take for example, you have 500,000 Lebanese who are working in the Gulf countries, and not only are they earning money, but they're also seeing with their own eyes what is this inequality that exists in societies, and they would like more. I mentioned Mohammed Bouazizi, who knew very well what was going on elsewhere throughout Tunis, and you could see the palaces that were built left and right by President Ben Ali, his wife, Mrs. Trabulsi, and all these other hangers on, if you would like. The rise of inequality was the primary phenomenon. There is a secondary phenomenon, of course, which is equally important, is that the nation-state system that has existed in the Arab world, in my view, has not allowed for the individual institutions in these individual countries to gain strength. And Islam is the only religion, I should say, is the only avenue left to vent one's frustrations when the institutions are essentially clamped down. This was the failure, I think this is what Ellen was talking about, this was the failure of good governance versus bad governance. What the Arab leaders have failed to realize is that they should have really encouraged throughout the past 50 years the independent development of these institutions where there is at least some representation. The exception being Lebanon, of course, where there is parliament, but the Iranians have taken care of that now for the foreseeable future.
All right. Ellen, do you want to take
Yeah,
that?
I was going to say, I think that the availability of information so people see what they're missing, but also, the Arab Spring was the beginning of a long, messy process of empowerment of individuals. And in a way, a young teenager from a middle-class family deciding to join ISIL is empowerment of individuals. Some of the anecdotal evidence is really quite surprising that young Tunisians who were excited when Nahda became the governing power, a sort of moderate Islamic party becomes the governing power in Tunisia, but didn't change their lives fast enough. They got disillusioned, and how quickly they could get radicalized. To literally go from voting for Nahda to joining ISIL, to me, is kind of, it sort of makes your head spin. But how quickly, because of information, because of mobility, because of enough prosperity to be able to buy a plane ticket to Istanbul, and then somebody gets you over into the Syrian border. So in a paradoxical way, this is part of the empowerment of individuals that I think we've been seeing since the Arab Spring. It's hopefully not the end of the story, and it'll move in more productive directions over time. But that's at least one explanation.
Do you want to answer quickly?
Yeah.
Okay.
What we see basically is a phenomenon which we know in political science. It's a revolution of rising expectations. At a certain point, Arabs had the social media means to look elsewhere, and they saw what was happening elsewhere. Not only that, if we take a look at the economic performance of Egypt and Tunisia in the last years, actually they were doing gradually much better than before, in Tunisia in particular. So there were rising expectations. Another important thing, as an outsider, I think the Arab world that had a glorious past finds itself in a terrible crisis. And this creates a lot of frustration. And then they revert indeed to the old identity, the only identity which they still can hold to. And the third point, again, about wealth, it's not wealth. If we take a look at the Arab regimes that have done well in the Arab Spring, it's primarily the monarchies. And monarchies is not only money. Jordan doesn't have money. Morocco doesn't have money. There is a certain thing, political institutions, which seem to be more responsive, that seem to have more legitimacy. Those countries survived this wave. I don't know what will happen in the future. But it's quite clear that monarchies have done better than republics. And all this talk about liberty, representation, which is associated with republics, makes no sense in the political culture of the region.
Sorry, ma'am, if you have a question here in the second row.
I think one of the hurdles, to the global cooperation to fight against ISIS is that the level of urgency each country feels is very different. For example, South Korea, you mentioned about, the ISIS is not a direct threat to the United States. I think that's the case of South Korea too, although we have one, teenager who joined the ISIS as a fighter. But I think definitely few South Koreans would feel that, the ISIS is a direct threat to South Korea. So I think this kind of the different level of urgency, toward the ISIS threat is one of the hurdles to the global cooperation. So I'm just wondering, I think the media, from the Stimson Center, a lady from the Stimson Center, she can answer my questions. I think, what does the ISIS mean to countries like South Korea who have a very low level of, Muslim population? So we don't have any. Actually, the Muslim population here in South Korea, I understand, less than 1%. So I think the ISIS will not feel the need to appeal to the Muslim population. So what does the ISIS mean to countries like South Korea?
Well, I would think that one of the things you have to think about is your trade relations with countries of the Middle East, of whether, if ISIS were to control part of the territory of a country with which you have an important economic relationship, it's not that Korean citizens are going to be recruited. It's that Korea's ability to achieve its other goals are going to be impeded if territory in the strategically important Middle East are, under the control of ISIS. I remember a BBC program on the police chief of Kirkuk. So here you have, trying to hold on to towns that are not under ISIS control, the beginning of the negotiating that's going on between ISIS-controlled territory and normal Iraqi-controlled territory, of accepting this non-state actor as having amazing power. And it will affect the mobility of non-Middle Easterners to work and travel and do business in this part of the world. So I think these are secondary effects. It's not that you should worry that ISIS is going to come to Korean territory or that a significant number of Koreans are going to join ISIS. It's whether it is a genuine impediment to Korea's economic engagement with the Middle East, I think. Yes.
I think I saw another hand up over here, sir.
I wanted to ask the following question. Iran and Saudi Arabia have both been accused of being sponsors of terrorism. I just wanted to ask the four guest speakers, how ironic do you think it is that they're both engaging in a proxy war in Yemen at the moment?
Yeah. Do you want to take that on? This is another problem with asking the region to take care of this issue is then you end up in a proxy
I don't
war.
think it's ironic. Take a look at the Persian history. Hegemonic power trying to rule the regions that it has ruled in the past with a revolutionary zeal. And the countries in the region are afraid of it, and they try to counter this phenomenon. The Saudi support to the opposition groups of Assad is basically a result of the establishment of the Iranian Shiite corridor. Iraq is ruled by an Iranian client. Further west is Syria, Assad, who has been aligned, his family has been allied with Iran. This is the oldest alliance in the Middle East. And being an Alawi is a problematic Muslim, but he received a kosher certificate for being a Muslim from the mullahs in Tehran. And afterwards, Hezbollah in Lebanon. So, it's... And Saudi Arabia has never fought, what we see in Yemen, it's unusual. Usually it has, his modus operandi has been very different. So now it finally got the guts maybe to do something.
Sorry.
It's not unusual. What we see in Saudi Arabia is not unusual at all. Finally, I think this question, which is a brilliant question, is the reason why we should not use terrorism anymore. We should use violence. Because obviously what the Iranians are doing and what the Saudis are doing are totally different. As Ephraim said, Iran's interest is to create a Shia arc, so to speak, something which has been going on for millennia, nothing new. But what Saudi Arabia is trying to do in Yemen in particular and elsewhere throughout the Muslim world is to make sure that the nation-state system that exists survives. And you yourself have said that the monarchies have done much better, whereas we associate liberty with republics. But there were no republics in the Arab world. There were dictatorships. Let's not insult the idea of Jeffersonian republic with what we had. That's, the legacy of dictatorships, whether it was in Egypt, whether it was in Syria or elsewhere. The reason why the monarchies are doing there, because the ruling families are far more legitimate, but they're entitled to defend themselves. And this is what Saudi Arabia is doing. It is defending itself.
Remember, the old phrase used to be, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The Israelis are not exempt from this pattern of behavior, okay? Of supporting non-state actors in an attempt to weaken another possible rival or non-state actor. Then that non-state actor becomes competent and develops its own tactics, which may or may not look like terrorism. So I think this is a pattern that we've seen across the region.
Right. Sorry,
Yeah.
Dr. Park.
I'd like to, one thing, make sure that before worrying too much about the so-called Shiite Christian or Iranian involvement in the Middle East, I think more than anything else, the Sunni Arab countries should consider their own Shiite citizens with justice and fair. Otherwise, actually, why Iran is so scary? Because the Sunni countries, especially are surrounding the Persian Gulf area, they do not, take good care of their own Shiite citizens. That's the problem. So you have to mend your fences first and then talk about others, especially Iranian. And also probably there should be many people are talking about the Shiite revival with Shiite crescent, but Arab Sunnis has their own identity, and they would not join any Iranians actually, simply because they share the same religion. They are different, they speak the different languages. The problem actually is not with Iran. I think personally, I think the problem is within the Sunni, the monarchies. And as long as they continue their own policy toward the Shia citizens, there will be no hope in the Middle East. And another group like ISIS will pop up anytime because they are, well, they hate Shias. They hate Shias and no end. Well, this is my own personal.
I think I'm going to okay, one really quick
I
question.
think we shouldn't throw out the baby with the water. Terrorism has a negative connotation, which it deserves. Terrorism has a clear definition. Using force against, indiscriminately against civilians. And this is something nobody should do. And maybe what we are talking about is not terrorism, I agree. But we should not say that the term terrorism is not useful anymore. It is, and it has rightly a normative connotation.
So I think we unfortunately have to leave it there, but maybe if you have some more questions, you could just come up afterwards and ask the panelists directly. But please join me in thanking our four panelists here for the interesting discussion. Thank you.